Hello, everyone. Today we are going to be solving equations with applications. So if you guys could, first of all, cross off the first ignite that's here, but I want you to try the second ignite. Pause your video now and give it a shot. All right, you should have got 12.5 hours for your final answer on this one because it tells us that you want to spend $60. And because it says Y is the total cost, that means you're going to plug in 60 in for Y in the equation, and then we can solve. First step, you should have subtracted 10 from both sides. And then to undo multiplying by 4, you should have divided by 4. So before I get into today, there are two definitions that we need to go over first. The first of which is called complementary angles. So we're getting a little bit of our geometry fix it for today. And complementary angles are just any angles that add up to 90 degrees. So you guys know in terms of angle measurements, an angle is something where it's kind of like a measure between two different lines. It's like the space kind of between-ish. So if something adds, complementary just means it adds up to 90, and supplementary just means it adds up to any angles add up to 180 degrees. So if we look down at example 1, we'll use those definitions in just a moment, but we're going to start by translating. The first application problems we can do are the translation ones, where I might ask you to translate something into equation and then solve. So that's what we're going to do first with example 1, part A. It says 14 less than 3/4 of a number is -8. So the first thing I always look for is the is, because that's going to tell me where my sign is going to go. And that also tells me what I know is going to go on the other side. Is just means this is an equals. If it was like is less than, we would put a less than symbol in there. Is greater than or equal to, we would use our greater than or equal to symbol, so on and so forth. But is just means equals, so that's what I'm going to put. Now the other side, the left side of this, let's reread this again. It says we're going to do 14 less than. And remember, guys, here, because there's no is, this less than just means subtraction. And it means I'm going to subtract 14 from whatever comes next. Less than, remember, that phrase always means switch the order. So what it's less than is 3/4 of a number. So I'm going to take 3/4, which is, I'm going to represent with my fraction. And of just means multiplication. So 3/4 times a number. So if we kind of clean some of this up, I got to shift some of this guy over. What you have here, though, this is the equation that we're going to go ahead and solve. So what I want you guys to do right now, pause your video, and I want you guys to solve for n in this problem. All right, you should have got n equals 8. And the reason is because when we start solving, between multiplying by 3/4 and subtracting 14, the first thing that we always undo is anything that's being added or subtracted. So here, because I'm subtracting 14, to undo that, we're going to add that to the other side. And what that does is that cancels this out. -14 plus 14 is 0. Now, when we get down to the other step, this is what you were left with. But here, because we're multiplying by 3/4, we undo that by multiplying by the reciprocal. So we're going to multiply by 4/3. And that's what I have to multiply this side of the equation by. But if you take 6 times that, you get 8 as your answer. So we have one more translation one. Now here's where those vocab words from above are going to kind of come into play. It says angle 1 measures x degrees. Its complement is 40 more than 4 times the measure of angle 1. What are the measures of both angles? So the first thing we want to kind of take away, there's a lot going on in this problem, but the first thing that I know that I see is that we have two different angles. We have angle 1 and we have angle 2. So there's two different angles that they're telling us are complementary angles. If you're saying one angle complements another in geometry, it just means that they add to 90 degrees. So overall, my equation right now, I know that if I take the measure of whatever angle 1 is and the measure of whatever angle 2 is, it just means if you add them together, they should end up being 90. Now, what I'm going to actually fill in those blanks, well, we need to kind of figure out what those two angles actually are. So if I'm going to shift this over just a little bit, it tells me, first of all, that angle 1 measures x degrees. So I already know that angle 1 is going to be represented by x. Angle 2, it says its complement is 40 more than 4 times the measure of angle 1. So it's 40 more. That means I'm going to add 40 to whatever 4 times the measure of angle 1 is, which we know is x. So I'm going to add 40 to it, and I'm going to multiply it by 4. And that is going to be whatever the measure of angle 2 is. Whoop, put in 42. So what we're going to be doing now is simply that. We are going to go ahead now and solve. We're not just going to stop at translating. So what I want you guys to do right now, pause your video, and I want to see if you guys can try solving this equation right here. All right, you should have got x equals 10 if you solved it correctly. And that's because our first step has to be, we're going to go ahead and combine like terms. Remember, first 2 steps we look for is if there's anything to distribute, which we don't have. But here we do have like terms. If I have 1x plus 4x, that's 5x. And now I have 5x plus 40. So out of the 2, we are multiplying by 5 and adding 40. So the first thing you should have undone is subtract 40 over to the other side. When you do that, 40 minus 40 cancels. You're just left with 5x. But you do have to remember to do it on the other side. 90 minus 40 is 50. And then obviously to undo multiplying by 5, we divide by 5, and that gives us x equals 10. Now we do want to be careful that we actually pause and just say, am I actually answering the question? If I look at this last statement, it says, what are the measures of both angles? Well, you're probably saying, well, why do we need to just solve that? Well, to find the actual measurements, we actually need to know what x is. Since angle 1 is measuring whatever x is, now that I know x equals 10, I know the measure of angle 1 is 10 degrees. And I can also find the measure of angle 2. The measure of angle 2 tells me that if I take 4 times whatever x is plus 40, but that's going to be the measure of angle 2. Well, if I take 4 times 10, we get 40 plus 40 is 80. And it makes sense because these 2 angles, if I add them together, they should add up to 90 degrees, and 10 plus 80 is 90. Now, there's other types of word problems that we could potentially do. I could give you one where I give you an equation, kind of like this one. It says Kristen went to the store to buy school supplies. The equation that models what Kristen bought is given by 3.5n plus 0.39p equals 15, where n is the number of notebooks and p is the number of pencils. So the question I'm going to read at the end, it says, how many pencils can she buy if she buys 2 notebooks? Well, I want to make sure I plug 2 in for the correct variable. I'm looking for the variable that represents the number of notebooks. And I know that in this problem, that's what it tells me n represents. So in my equation, I'm going to go down here. We're going to plug in 2 for n. And now we can go ahead and solve. First thing I'm going to do is simplify. So I can actually do 3.5 times 2, which is 7. Oopsies. And I'm going to bring everything else on down. Now to continue solving here, we have to kind of say, okay, well, what's happening? Well, I'm multiplying p by 0.39, but I'm also adding 7. So what that tells me is I need to go ahead and I need to start solving. So the first thing that we're going to undo is the adding of 7. So I'm going to subtract 7 over to the other side. 7 minus 7 is going to cancel. I'm going to be left with 0.39p, which is equal to 15 minus 7, which is 8. And now all we have to do is undo the multiplication. I know it's a decimal, but it's still we're still multiplying by a number. So to undo that, we're going to divide by that 0.39, and it's going to give us our answer of p equals 20.5. Now, because it's a word problem, we do want to make sure we answer the full question. It says, how many pencils can she buy if she buys 2 notebooks? Well, I know that here it says you can buy 20.5, but then when we solve this, we didn't take into account what actually makes sense in real life. You can't buy when you go to the store, you can't buy 0.5 of a pencil. Now, that doesn't just automatically mean we round up though, because if you have 15, like right here, if you're going to buy 2 notebooks, this is the only amount of pencils that you can afford. I can only afford 20.5 pencils. A lot of students have the tendency to want to round up here, but if you can only afford 20.5 pencils, you definitely can't afford 21. So we do have to pay attention with money that if you can't buy this 0.5, that means you can only buy 20 pencils. And that is our final answer. Now, sometimes with some of the word problems, I might not give you the equation. And that's what example 3 is really going to cover. Here, our job is going to be, we want to write the equation of this, and then we can go through and solve. So one of the first things that we'll usually do with most word problems is we'll kind of break it down by steps. The first of which is we're going to do something called defining the variable. And that is kind of like, what is the thing that we're trying to find in this problem? Well, if I look through my directions, let's read this problem. It says the selling price of a television in a retail store is $66 less than 3 times the wholesale price. If the selling price of the television is $899, write and solve an equation to find the wholesale price of the television. So when we're defining our variable, I want to look in here to where it's going to give me a clue as to what we're trying to find. And you will always find that usually in the sentence that's asking you the question. And this one, in this particular example, it's the second sentence. It says, if the selling price of a television is $899, write and solve an equation to find the wholesale price of the television. So when we say define our variable, it literally means tell me what variable, what letter you're going to choose. So I'm just going to use a W to represent wholesale price. And when we say define it, it literally just means in words, tell me what you're letting W represent. We're letting W represent the wholesale price of the TV. Now we have to come to the second part, which is actually writing the equation for this. So if we're going to write our equation, let's read that first sentence. The selling price of a television in a retail store is 66 less than 3 times the wholesale price if the selling price of the television is $899. So here it says the selling price of the television in a retail store is, that's letting you guys know where your equal sign is. And down here, it tells us what the selling price of the television was. So when I start my equation, I'm going to start with 899 equals. And then let's see what else is there. It says 66 less than 3 times the wholesale price. Well, we're letting W represent my wholesale price. So if it's 66 less than, that tells us we're going to be subtracting 66 from whatever 3 times the wholesale price is. So in my blank, I'm going to have 3 times W. And there's your equation. Part C then says usually the first step is always going to be to write it. Obviously, the next step, part C, is going to be, the next step is going to be to solve. So this right here is my equation. And now to solve, we have right now, it looks like we're multiplying by 3 and subtracting 66. So we're going to undo that by undoing our subtraction first. I'm going to add 66 over to this side. 899 plus 66 is going to end up being 965. And then to find the wholesale price, we want to undo multiplying by 3 by dividing by 3. And we're going to get our W is going to be equal to 321.67. Now that is our answer. But again, we are in a real world problem. When we answer this in a complete sentence, we have to think about, does that answer actually make sense? Can you have decimals when you're listing out whatever the price of the TV is? Yeah, it just means that those are the cents. So when I answer this question, we're going to say the cost of the wholesale price, sorry, not the cost, the wholesale price. The wholesale price of the TV, because that's what we have as our description, is $321.67. All right. So if you guys want to give it a shot, I do have a You Try Now going over this type of problem. So pause your video now and unpause for the answers. All right, answers are up. Now, again, when you guys are writing your variable or defining it, the variable that you choose, it doesn't really matter what variable you picked. I chose W because what our variable is in the question, it says how many weeks will it take before you can buy the shoes? So you need something to represent the number of weeks. So I chose W. So to write our equation, it says that the store sells Converse for $59. You have $13 saved so far, and you're going to save $4 per week. So that's where this part of the equation is, and it's equaling whatever the cost of the Converse is. Part C, all you have to do is then solve, subtract 13, and then divide by 4, and you get 11.5. But remember, to answer it in question D, we want to actually make sure that our answer makes sense. So if here it's talking about the number of weeks, here, since you only get your allowance once a week, you can't have 0.5 of a week. So if it would take you an extra half week in order to save for these shoes, that just means you have to go a whole extra week. So instead of 11, you would say, or instead of 11.5, final answer was you should have said it takes about 12 weeks. Okay. All right, guys, that's it for today. You guys can move on and start working on the homework for the day.